So today I want to speak about how we develop skills to mediate disagreement. In our discussions about the role that those of us at Church of the Holy City in Washington can play in helping our country, our church, our communities, and even families, we've been looking at different ways we can help overcome polarization. The sermon interview today continues our series of spiritual entrepreneurs who are coming up with spiritually inspired solutions to difficult problems and focusing on new ways for us to engage in healthy dialogue. Now, this coming week is Thanksgiving, and that has a long tradition of bringing people together, family and friends, and sharing what we're grateful for. But what I'm struck with this Thanksgiving, and maybe over the last 5 years or so, is many people tell me they're no longer joining the family and the friends for Thanksgiving because they're afraid the meal will break down into political battles. The breakdown of this Thanksgiving into political battles was highlighted in a very comic way, brilliantly, in a Saturday Night Live skit in 2015. And if you stay to the end of the discussion, you'd like to see it, I'll click on it. It's very funny. But it's not really funny when it's your family and you're not wanting to go home because you're afraid of what's going to happen. Now, our tradition teaches that the extent that you love your neighbor is how you really love God. There's no loving God without loving your neighbor. And it's really the neighbor who disagrees with us the most that's the most important. It's easy to love the neighbor, the family member, the friend who agrees with you on everything. In the gospel today, the religious leaders try to force Jesus to choose a side, and they ask him if he'll support Rome's taxes. What he's really teaching us is to be a follower of Jesus means not being loyal to any political ideology. Our loyalty is to God, and that's a loyalty to love. We need to be engaged in our world, and we have to do it from pure motivations to do good. And we must give to Caesar what is Caesar and God what is God's. Our tradition also teaches that faith without any action in the world is dead. So Swedenborg's insight today that we are essentially what we love, and that leads us toward heaven, means that when it says love, it's how we love others. And it's only really evident when we can show love for people whose viewpoints we disagree with. Now, there's a whole class of experts in our culture right now who are really good at navigating some of these conflicts, and they are called mediators. Maybe you've worked with one in your life, or maybe you'd like to hire one. They're trained. They often play referees in disputes, and very often they're brought in instead of going to court with a judge, trying to figure out a way to resolve things. So much of the work of mediators is very often it could be a small property disputes, your fence is on my lawn. But increasingly, mediators in our culture are being asked to deal with broken family situations. And they're having to make really solemn-like choices between who gets the parent, who gets the child, where does the child go, does the child stay in the institution? Really, really tough decisions, and they mediate those. Now, a few mediators have suggested that much of what we're learning in that field of mediation could also be used and applied to our nation's polarized political cultures. And I've been particularly impressed by the work of our young social entrepreneur here today, Ryan Nakade, who co-hosts a podcast called Meta Ideological Politics, where he and his co-hosts seek to help people increase their ability to see and understand different worldviews. And you can watch their interview with me in their newsletter. Ryan, who's here with me, grew up in Hawaii. And as a young man, this peacemaker trained to become a boxer. And he has spent many years training people to be a boxer. His mother is a Buddhist priest at a temple in Hawaii. And his dad is a New Testament scholar with a degree from Pacific School of Religion. So that's quite a family pedigree of deep spiritual thinkers, and Ryan embodies both. Ryan and his wife moved to Portland, Oregon from Hawaii, and he sort of went from paradise to the epicenter of America's polarized culture wars. If you know anything that's going on around the Portland area, it's some of the most tense and violent clashes on political views. And in that space, Ryan has been offering mediation services. And he's looking at what he's learning from groups and individuals to say, what could we do with politics? Most notably, he's developed a concept which I think is very clever, which he calls Titanium Man. And I'll ask him to explain that. I've mentioned it in a sermon myself about him. So Ryan, first, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm seeing how this shows up on the camera here, so we'll get you closer. Maybe I think we're gonna change the backdrop to something so our heads are not, let's see if this looks there. We'll go to a different background so it's not disorienting. Okay, so Ryan, thanks for joining us. So first I was gonna say, can you tell us like the nature of your work? What does a mediator do? What do you do on a regular basis?
Yeah, so a mediator is not a judge, right? We handle conflicts and we handle disputes, but we do not call any shots. We do not take any sides. We just help the parties in conflict. We help them to have a conversation and facilitate it in such a way so that we can move towards an agreement or a resolution that works, that's a win-win, that works for all parties, but that they consent to and agree to and create themselves. So we don't have a say in how it goes. We just help them have the conversation, and through a productive dialogue, they come to their own solutions.
Oh, so that's a big difference between courts where you're going to have both sides present their case and somebody makes a decision. In mediation, you facilitate discussion, which sounds actually a lot more sustainable.
Right.
So when you're doing your mediation, what do you see in the work that you do each day? And I know you do a lot of workshops. What's the biggest challenge that you face doing mediation?
You know, there are a lot of challenges. I think one of them is the resistance for one side to try to understand or empathize or humanize with the other side, right? So I think there are several ways of trying to do that, but yeah, sometimes people's attitudes are very resistant, and so it can be difficult to work with the personality clashes and also some of the content, some of the objects of the conflict that come up. And as you were mentioning in the intro, right, I do also work as a facilitator and contract with the Department of Human Services, trying to facilitate some very contentious situations involving child welfare and adoption, and the parents trying to have the children returned to their care. So these are very high stakes conflicts in a way, and sometimes it can be very stressful, but I've still found it to be a very rewarding profession.
I can imagine. So let me ask you this. You said that people have a hard time humanizing the person they're disagreeing with.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that is? Why do we want to dehumanize each other in a dispute?
I think there are kind of two different categories. So the first one is that, especially with the work I do with the Department of Human Services, people's desires are so strong, right? We really want what we want. And so if there's an obstacle to that, i.e. the person that we're in a dispute with, and
Mm-hmm.
they're blocking us from getting what we want, it's incredibly frustrating. And we don't want to hear their side of what they have to say or their side of the story, because we're so fixated in our desires, right? I think the second one, which is really the one that I'm most passionate about pioneering and developing, is, especially when it comes to politics, is the conceptual or philosophical or ideological blockages where people, even if they're intending to understand someone, simply do not understand what the heck the other person is saying,
Right.
Because we live in such different worlds with different languages, even if it's all in English, there's different concepts, different languages, different ideas, different cultures, different values, and we're just not seeing eye to eye. So facilitating understanding in that way is what I'm most excited about trying to do.
It's so interesting. So now let's switch gears here. So you've been doing this at the personal level. I'm just curious, where do you see this being applied to politics? We're very, very polarized. We're very much dehumanized each other. It's very common for people to say, like, I don't even want to think about that other party or that other political person as a human being. They're a moron, an idiot. They're evil. They're fascist. They're communist. They're something that I can dehumanize. So how do you see taking the lessons that you're learning in mediation, and how are you applying that in politics, and what's that look like?
Yeah, so I would say that there are several specific techniques I use when working with very polarized groups. And basically all of the techniques involve people from both sides, or from all sides really, gaining a more comprehensive, more intimate, and more holistic understanding of the other person and their perspective that goes deeper than some of those labels that you just mentioned, right? So when we label someone, we instantly dehumanize them, and we think that there's nothing more to them than their political identity, right? We've conflated their opinions with their own personal identity, and we're unable to see past that. So some of the work I do involves diving deeper first by looking at ourselves, by looking at our own biases, by looking at our own ideological predilections, by looking at our own values, right? What kind of information sources we use, what kind of personal experiences and emotional experiences inform our views. And then from there, we're able to look beyond the labels that we've projected onto people and into a more complex, rich, holistic vision of who they are and how they came to their decision. And in that way, facilitating not only a mutual humanization, empathy, but also deeper thinking, deeper critical reflection and deliberation on our own thinking, our own opinions, and our own processes for how we reach conclusions.
So I'm increasingly finding, particularly among younger people, that I kind of grew up believing in free speech, that everybody, even, pretty much tolerated, you would almost say even hate speech, speech you didn't agree with. I'm hearing a lot of younger people saying that they don't feel safe. So let's say I'm gay and say someone is being anti-gay, and then you tell me that I've got to get into their head and I've got to understand them. And I say to you, actually, I don't want to do that because they're a threat to me. Maybe not even physically, but mentally, they're a threat. Why should I try to get into the mindset of an evil person who is bigoted? What would you say to that?
I think there's a whole range of responses. So I actually, a high school student in Portland who was interviewing me asked me that question, and I gave him 4 different responses, and hopefully he would bite on any one. Right? Yeah. So the first response was a practical.
So he literally said that he didn't want to get into the other person's head.
Right. Yeah. And also, why would I even put in the time to try to do that?
Exactly.
Why do? What's the gain from doing that?
So what were your 4 strategies?
So the first one was probably the most, what's the word? Kind of cynical one, which is that if there's someone you really or have a disagreement over, something, isn't it important to try to kind of take their perspective, even if it was simply to be able to refute or debunk what they're saying?
Right. So practical.
There's a practical kind of debate or argumentative aspect. Now, I don't promote that obviously with my work, but even if that was someone's starting point, I'll take it just for them to explore another perspective, right? So there is a practical self-defense kind of aspect to them. Another one was, you might come across something that expands your mind and can shift or not necessarily change, but enrich and build on your perspective, right? So we're not doing this with an attitude of, oh, maybe I'll encounter something, an idea or a perspective that will completely supplant what I believe now, or completely take precedence or trump what I believe in. It's doing it with an attitude to expand our lens, to expand our perspective. And in doing so, the third one is we're able to become friends with people. We're able to befriend a larger array of people that we might not been able to develop a friendship with otherwise. And the studies have shown that doing so is actually the best way to change someone's mind who might have a very negative or bigoted or condescending view of you, right? Because over time, through that relationship, they'll say, oh, you're not at all who I thought you were. You've broken the stereotypical character that I've held of you in my head. And I've seen you as a person, right? Not this caricatured idea that I've inherited unconsciously from the culture wars.
Oh, those are really good practical solutions. So I mentioned in my comments this idea of titanium man that you're developing. And we all know what straw man is. It's when I create an opponent out of straw. It's not a real, it's a cartoon of their viewpoints. I don't really care to get into any complicated nature. It's kind of like writing somebody off, and it's the weakest argument. And it's just, conservatives are about saving money on taxes, and they're generally bigoted, and liberals are pie in the sky utopians who want to spend everybody else's money, just sort of like straw. There's not much thought. And we use those all the time. So then the idea of a steel man came up, and a steel man is when you say, I'm going to make the best argument. I'm going to make a good argument for the other side. And how would I understand what they're saying and really make it well? And you said we need something even different. We need a titanium man, which is your phrase, which I thought was really brilliant. Can you explain to us what you mean by that, titanium man?
Sure. So just to rehash really quickly, so the straw man, as you explained, usually involves kind of like oversimplifying or misrepresenting someone's argument or perspective, so that if you repeated it to them, they would say, that's not what I said. It's extremely frustrating to be straw man, right?
Right.
A steel man is you repeat it in a very clear way that is accurately representative of what they said, that highlights the strongest points of their argument. And so if you said, you paraphrase just their steel man. You say, is that what you said? They say, yeah, I think you got it. So the titanium man is going one step beyond the steel man, where you actually look to make the other person's argument even more nuanced, complex, sophisticated, and multi-perspectival than they've made it themselves.
Wow.
Right. So it's going beyond simply accurately re-representing what they said. You're remixing their argument to take it to a whole nother level of richness, a whole nother level of complexity, and a whole nother level of even subtlety and sophistication. And to me, the notion of the titanium man is important because it shows that we can break out of not only straw manning or positively steel manning someone, but that if there's an idea or a perspective that we don't like, we can transform it to a level that we can find genuine resonance with, and even some genuine truth and value and goodness in. And so if there's an idea out there that and people representing those ideas that really annoy me and trigger me, the titanium man is my way of saying, now I'm going to search, and sometimes you have to search with a magnifying glass, with a microscope, to find those little bits of truth or those little bits of goodness or beauty in them. But once I find those little pieces, then I can blow them up. I can make a Ryanized version of them that still retains the crux of what they're saying, but it's infused with my own personal spin. So if I repeat the titanium man to someone, they may or may not agree that with it, but it's at least a way to build a bridge with someone in a way that you can find some authentic coherence with. And it takes a lot of compassion, openness to even start that process. So it's also the notion that ideas can be transformed beyond the ways that we've gotten locked into their use, and to transform them into a new way, and to kind of engender that creativity and how we play with ideas is kind of the notion behind the titanium man.
That's beautiful. I think it's a very spiritual concept, and it's a lot of work. So I think most people would say, like, I don't really want to spend a lot of my time in that other person's mind or in their thoughts. It almost strikes me as a spiritual ability. Now, you were raised Buddhist, or are you practicing Buddhist now, would you say, or how would you describe your spiritual energy?
It's interesting because for me personally, subjectively, I don't identify as a Buddhist.
Right.
But I think if most people who understood Buddhism and started interrogating me about what my spiritual path consists of, whatever answer I'd give, they say that sounds pretty darn Buddhist.
Yeah. So where do you draw, like, where do you get the strength or the compassion to go into another person's mind who you might at some level despise what they think? So where do you get that energy? Or, I mean, have you always been curious about other people, or where do you get that?
Beautiful. So I'd say there's two primary, the two driving forces that motivate me. One is that I can't stand the feeling of being locked into a partial narrow view. Like the notion that I can only pick one perspective, or that I can only look at things in one way, that somehow really bothers me. When I was a kid, my parents are very liberal, Democrats, and I remember there was an election and my dad had made a very negative comment about Republicans or something, or some conservative position. And even as a child, I said, how could it be true that the entire country is wrong? Like that doesn't feel right to me. And even if that was true, I just refuse to accept that. I can't bear the feeling of not feeling whole. And so in my quest for wholeness and integration, the yearning to titanium man things so that I can integrate that, I can create a connection with those ideas, I can create a connection with that side, the other side, and make it a part of myself. If I don't do that, I just feel really depressed. And that allows me, which is the second part, to form these deep and rich and complex relationships with people that I would normally disagree with or be very annoyed with. And that enriches our relationship and our discussion about these ideas, and allows me to engage with them in a way that's authentic and integrous to myself, but also is a way to explore their own ideas on their own terms. So I'm not asking you to jump into my world. I'm going to come into your world, but still mediated through my own authentic remix of what you said.
Right. Now, I think so. To be personal, I think you're more of a Bernie, would you say, person in the like more the Bernie perspective of more liberal wing of the Democratic Party?
In a way, I would say I resonate with Andrew Yang.
Andrew Yang, that's right, Andrew Yang. So you're on that. So how do you, if you're dealing with a Republican or a Trump Republican particularly, but it could be any Republican, how do you approach that? Because you do a lot of this. So how do you engage with, say, Republicans, and particularly more populist Republicans?
Sure. Well, I think there are several things. There are kind of two in terms of like communication.
Yeah, how do you even
or
get, how do you even approach, why are you so curious about that? Because you do spend a lot of time with people's on the right.
Yeah,
Yeah, so how do
absolutely.
you, where do you get, are you curious? Are you, is it the whole
Mhm.
thing that you just spoke about? How do you do that?
I'm very curious. Oh, so internally, there's internal and there's a
Yeah.
interpersonal. So internally, I'm very curious. I'm very interested in making new friends, and I'm interested in the perspective that they have that I don't have, so that I can again attain that sense of wholeness. I'm
Ah,
not whole if I'm only in my own bubble. I can't stand being in a bubble, and I feel really depressed. I feel like I'm not experiencing life. I feel I'm not grokking and embracing a larger array of perspectives and worldviews. And so then interpersonally, there are really two things that I like to proceed with. One is to really ask about people's value, get to understanding people's values and identities.
yeah,
And we were talking about earlier, like when it comes to a lot of Trump supporters, they really value his strength. He's strong. And strength is not something I naturally or intuitively value about people. Right. So when I hear them elaborate on why this notion of strength as a virtue is important, it's actually really invigorating and interesting to me, because I don't value strength, but I want to appreciate the notion of strength in a new way. And you're kind of transmitting that to me, right? So that's one reason. The second way I like to engage is I like to start by asking people what they believe and what their values are. And then I like to pivot to what I call metacognitive questions. And metacognitive questions are not about asking people what they believe, but how they think and how we should, as a society, come to certain conclusions, right? So it's how do you think? So when it comes, I talked a lot of like conspiracy theorists, for example. My
right,
favorite question to ask them is not what is true and what is false, what is fake news and what is not. How do you determine what is true and what is not true? There's a lot of fake news, there's a lot of disinformation. How do you determine what is true and what is not true? And how should we as a society, as a community, determine what is true and not true? And that's to me where the really interesting conversations happen, because it forces us to really think about these things.
yeah. It sounds like at one level you're saying if we're going to solve complex problems, we need all the possible perspectives that we can
Yes,
get, and that you realize you don't have all of them, and they might have something
beautiful.
for you. And now going full circle, our church is trying to do more work in the space of addressing polarization,
Mhm.
being a hub for that. What would you recommend to our church or our church community and churches in general to be involved in this developing deeper and more complex worldviews?
Yeah, there's so many things we can do. We can do a training together, or we could do some events together. There are some very specific techniques and processes and group practices I like to lead with communities who are experiencing polarization. I think it's really important to do it in church and spiritual and religious communities, because a lot of them, as you know, have really gone down in flames over political disagreements, which to me
Yes,
is deeply tragic.
that is tragic.
And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to apply the spiritual teachings that you're preaching and that we're trying to cultivate together. And sometimes our spiritual life doesn't always penetrate into our political life, right? We've
Right.
kind of compartmentalized them, and then we can pray, we can meditate, we can connect with God, we can connect with the divine. But when it comes to politics, that can all fly out the window, and suddenly you're a communist, you're a fascist, or you're a
Yeah,
racist, right?
right.
So merging those two, I think, is really important, and really allowing people's unique perspective to come forward. So one thing that I do with polarized groups is to first work with the different sides. Instead of bringing different sides, if there's polarization together initially, I work with them separately, and we go through a process where I ask each person what I call the anomaly question. And the anomaly question is, what is one thing you disagree with people who are on your own side? And when you do that with one group at a time, what it does is it breaks up the tribal groupthink, because each
Ah,
person realizes, hey, we're all on one side. And in a polarized environment, people tend to balkanize into tribes. But when you work with one tribe at a time and ask those questions, suddenly everyone's individuality becomes carved out of the tribalism. Then you bring the groups together, and you can do a process. You can use what I call the mind map technique, where people write down and explore different facets of their worldview. So values, emotions, identities, information sources, and what their hesitations or uncertainties are. Then we share them together. So we weave in subjective aspects of ourselves along with our political views. And then we can, there's also the practice of what I call reflective structured dialogue, which is a kind of ritualized process where you come up with really thought-provoking questions, and each person gets a chance to write down for 3 minutes or so what their answer will be after you prompt them with the question. Then everyone goes around and shares, and then the next question, people stop and write it down. So instead of just talking, it's talk, pause, reflect deeply, talk, pause, reflect deeply. So that kind of brings in, that softens the interaction while people humanize each other and enrich their understanding of the subject matter as well.
Beautiful. Well, I'm going to stop there with my questions. I'm going to open it up to everybody else during our discussion time. And particularly if you have a specific question that you wanted to have mediated, we have the expert here, so he will stay with us afterward for our discussion. But thank you so much for your work. And what's so exciting for me personally is that in a world where we're very aware of polarization, it's very exciting to see young leaders rising up who are trying to bridge the divide with the way Ryan is doing. And I think we've got to really thank you and support you in every way we can, and other leaders like you. And that's something that we want to do at Church of the Holy City. We want to be a place that does that. So thank you so much for joining it. And you'll stay for the discussion, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
yes,
cool.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Can you sit down?
Yeah, sure.